All right, sometimes it's raining outside and you really need a sandwich. And not just any sandwich is gonna do, you have to have the best sandwich in Boston. I'm letting you in on a little bit of a secret. It's here. This is the 163 Vietnamese sandwich shop. You can get a lot of stuff in there. It's a tiny front, but my personal favorite is right here, the vegetarian duck banh mi. It's a fantastic sandwich. You've got a really crisp baguette, you've got some jalapenos on it, you've got this mock duck, I think it's made out of gluten. This is just the best sandwich you can get in town. Now, banh mi, which you may know already, is something of a hybrid food. It comes out of French colonial Indochina or Vietnam, and we're gonna get into that in a little bit. But before we do that, I want you to think a little bit about all the foods that you enjoy that actually are the product of empire. Here's an easy one, chocolate. Chocolate, of course, is an Aztec food, but the way that we eat it now comes out of a very particular tradition of Mesoamerican ingredients with Spanish taste, and then the introduction of sugar out of the system that we talked about before. Or think about a curry house in Britain and all of the Indian foods that moved back from the colony to the metropole. And of course, then, there's banh mi. We're gonna come to that in just a minute, but for now, let me enjoy the best sandwich in Boston. Hey everyone, Benjamin Siegel here, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. Last time we spent a lot of time talking about food and nationalism and food and nations. What does it mean to have a national food? What does it mean to think about French food or Italian food or Chinese food or Mexican food, and how much credence we can give to that idea? This time I want us to talk about food and imperialism and food and empires. And we have to start off by thinking about what actually an empire is. This history might be familiar to some of you. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, though it had started earlier, European nations went into deep competition, working to colonize much of Asia and Africa. There are a lot of big, lofty claims about what imperialism actually would mean, about the idea of uplifting people, of bringing civilization to benighted peoples around the world. There was that classic idea of Rudyard Kipling and the white man's burden. The French had a different term for it. They called it la mission. That civilizing ideology, the idea of making people into something else, of transforming them into Western notions of civilization, that of course extended to what people ate, the diets that they had. So imperialism was really a process of colonizing diets as well. There was a Frenchman, J.A. Colombani, who wrote, he said, "We had the responsibility to lead the people of our overseas territories to political and social maturity, to integrate them, to imbue them with our civilization. And is not bread the typical food of civilized people?" This was a pretty classic sentiment. The only thing is, food and imperialism worked in funny ways. Modern technology and practices generally flowed from Europe to the colonies. But in the area of food, the movement was actually a little bit more complicated. Things went back and forth. There are certain products of imperialism that really changed the way that Europeans ate as well. This was the moment when the British began eating things like rice and curry, and the French developed a taste for couscous, which came from their Algerian colony. Today, we're going to look at British and French imperialists in India and Vietnam, and then we're going to turn our attention briefly to the imperial powers and their relationship with food in Africa. All the while, I want us to just keep in mind the different ways in which Africans and Asians responded to the impositions of imperial culinary power, based on the existing culinary traditions that they already held. So let's turn our attention first to India. Already, when we were talking about the spice wars, we saw how Indian Ocean outposts established in the 16th century to control the spice trade provided this staging point for the territorial domination of Asia. Over the course of the 18th century, beginning in the early 1700s and really picking up steam after 1757, the British East India Company extended its political and economic authority across the Indian subcontinent. At first, this was a private company, the East India Company, that controlled the subcontinent, but after 1857 and a major rebellion on the Indian subcontinent, it was under the direct rule of the British Crown. In the early years of the British East India Company, the resident merchants who came from England to India were often called Nababs. It was a play on the Indian term Nawab, meaning prince. And Nababs were described this way because of the local habits that they picked up. These merchants working in India adopted Indian dress. They wore Indian clothes. They took Indian wives or mistresses. And without any real anxiety, they mostly ate Indian food. In part, this was kind of natural, and I'll just ask you to remember what British food was like in the 17th century. Rather than the kind of bland cuisine that's often the stereotype around British food in this period was spicy. There was a real excitement over spices. So the British really didn't need to adapt that much at first. They had lots of heavily spiced dishes at home, and so it resembled a lot of Indian stews that they were eating, except of course in most places for the beef or the pork. But the sahibs of the late 19th century became increasingly concerned about the boundaries that they were drawing between the colony and the metropole. And they started drawing big distinctions in the cultural domains of food and other areas. Even at the height of the Raj, Anglo-Indians often ate curry and rice as an informal brunch, but by dinner time, they were eating in a much more kind of Victorian manner. The evening meals in the British Empire followed a strictly British menu of soup, an entree, a roast meat, a savory pudding, and sweets, and then it'd all be washed down by claret or beer. Even in the height of the Indian summer, British authorities would often wear dinner jackets or evening gowns. It was often a kind of ponderous and laborious way of eating, but it helped them draw these kind of cultural distinctions at a moment when they felt very important. Now, maintaining British standards of civilization in remote colonial outposts required a lot of effort. And one of the ways that happened was through the broad employment of servants. Imperial agents in the British Empire often employed many domestic servants, far more than they would have ever been able to afford at home, which made supervising the staff a really important role for the Memsahib, which was the British woman living for a long time in India. This was the moment when you saw lots of cookbooks in the British Empire. And those cookbooks recommended daily inspections of the kitchen to ensure cleanliness, since the British believed that Indians were totally lacking in hygiene, in spite of a concern for ritual purity. So setting an example for domesticity for servants was an essential foundation of imperial rule, and it was one that women frequently took on. But the search for a good cook was also a major preoccupation of the women, and to a lesser extent, the men of the British Empire working in India. Even as the agents of empire sought to instill British metropolitan culture in colonial outposts, Indian memorabilia began moving back to Victorian London as everyday reminders of the vast Britannic realm. There were dishes that moved from India to the United Kingdom and were remade there. Things like mulligatawny soup, which was an adaptation of an Indian dal. It was on the menus of elite clubs in London, and then it spread to lower and middle class restaurants in Britain. It became very common in 19th century and early 20th century Britain to eat things like chutneys or pickles, and they supplemented the traditional preserves of British housewives. Curry became an important dish in early 20th century Britain, in part because it was an easy way to recycle leftover meat or vegetables. And so curry became associated in Britain with something of a lower class dish. Because there was such a big British demand for Indian-style foods, many veterans of Indian service became important figures in food processing industries in Britain, including, and this was the rise of things like curry powders and chutneys, and they had names that were filled with imperial authority, things like Colonel Skinner and Major Grey, who made curry powders and chutney bottles. Usually this food didn't really look like Indian cooking at all. But locals soon adapted manufacturing techniques for their own goods back in India. A.B. Sircar was a returned migrant who had gone from India to the United States and then back to India. And he founded the Bengal Preserving Company at the turn of the 20th century to bring industrial and canned foods to India, where they quickly took off. But at the same time, Hindu and Muslim dietary restrictions limited the impact that colonialism had on the Indian diet. The British national dish in this period was roast beef, and a cow wasn't generally going to be eaten. The British Army learned how perilous this was in 1857, when they allegedly issued new Enfield rifles to their troops. In order to open a cartridge to load into this rifle, soldiers were asked to bite down on it, and it was alleged to have a mix of pork and beef fat, which would be intolerable for both Hindus and Muslims. But taboos changed in India over time. Beginning in 1840, there was a group of radicals who met at Hindu College in Calcutta who called themselves Young Bengal. And they made a big deal out of doing things like consuming beef or drinking whiskey. It was a rejection of Hindu traditions, a way of embracing a certain form of modernity. And in smaller ways, men at home or working out in the fields began experimenting with tea and other British-style drinks. And keep in mind that even when they weren't actively experimenting with new foods, the Columbian Exchange had totally changed Indian diets. Tomatoes had been well established in India right after the Columbian Exchange, but British authorities really worked hard to propagate new staples in India, things like maize and potatoes, in order to create a big export economy. So in the 19th century, you saw the creation of new dishes which now are iconically Indian. Things like aloo gobi, potatoes with cauliflowers, or makki di roti, which is a kind of corn flatbread. But sometimes these interactions were even more complicated. When Indians moved from India to the imperial capital in London, they sometimes found their beliefs strengthened in their own cultural ways. Mahatma Gandhi is a great example of this. He was born into a Hindu family in Gujarat in a provincial town that was really influenced by Jain tradition and a commitment to ahimsa, or nonviolence. He was raised as a fervent vegetarian, and when he came to London, he decided that he wanted to see why the British were so strong, since he attributed that to meat eating. So Gandhi experimented furtively with meat eating in his first years in London, before deciding that vegetarianism did offer him some real power. And Gandhi's first writing about politics and about civilization came through his association with vegetarian societies. Gandhi, of course, would be obsessed with food as a way of conveying civilizational difference. He did that through an embrace of vegetarianism in India and in his representation overseas, and also through the idiom of fasting, of not taking food, both of which were central to his understandings of nationalism and nonviolent struggle. Having talked about India, let's turn our attention to a somewhat different colonial encounter a little further east. In the middle of the 19th century, the French Emperor Napoleon III launched an invasion of Indochina, the place that we would think of as Vietnam, but also Cambodia today. Beginning with a small foothold in Saigon, the French eventually carved out a very small Asian empire for themselves. It reached from Hanoi in the north, across Vietnam, through Laos, and again into Cambodia. Even before the French had arrived in Indochina, Vietnamese food, as we've mentioned, was really already an imperial cuisine. The cuisine of Vietnam, like its language and its religious beliefs, had developed under the tutelage and supervision of China, which had ruled the country for close to 1,000 years. So Vietnam had incredibly diverse regional food traditions. There were simple, meatier dishes that were prevalent in the north, while there were more kind of curries and spices and seafoods towards the country's south. And the imperial capital of Hue, in the center of the country, had the most elaborate court cuisine. It was small, very intricate dishes that were reminiscent of Thai court foods. The Vietnamese adopted many Chinese cooking techniques and habits over time. Things like stir-frying, noodle making, and eating with chopsticks. But they also preserved very distinct regional tastes as well, a preference for uncooked herbs and vegetables as opposed to cooked ones, and a greater reliance on things like fermented fish sauce or nuoc mam than on soy sauce. Nuoc mam, which is fermented fish sauce, should also remind us of another imperial cuisine, which is ancient Roman cuisine, which also used garum, which was basically the same thing. Now, French colonists in Vietnam, much more so than their British counterparts in India, insisted on having access to familiar foods over time, although the climate required many different adjustments. In Hanoi and in Saigon, there were cafes, butcher shops, and sausage makers who opened up shops to cater to an arriving French population. The French also introduced a number of new crops to Vietnam, a lot of garden plants in particular, and asparagus they loved. The Vietnamese called asparagus Western bamboo, and when local crops failed to meet the growing French demand, the French imported canned asparagus instead. Many Vietnamese elites adopted the culture of their rulers. Phuoc To Hu was a major socialite in 19th century Vietnam, and he gained the respect of French colonists primarily for the lavish French banquets that he served. But culinary blending took place in all homes in Vietnam. The French, of course, needed to have baguettes wherever they went, but the traditional custodians of French civilization, or bakers, had widespread wheat shortages in Vietnam, so they learned to extend their dough with things like rice flour, which were in much greater supply. The Vietnamese also found other ways of eating baguettes as well. They would be just as likely to dip it in curry or to eat it with pâté. Colonial Indochina was also the site where French and Vietnamese hybridity reached new peaks in the creation of a number of new dishes. One of which is banh mi, a sandwich that really looks Parisian in some ways but is very distinctly Vietnamese in others. And banh mi moved from Vietnam to Paris by the 1950s, brought over by Vietnamese students and emigres. There was a shop in Paris called Ho Nam, which is said to have popularized the banh mi in Paris. Even canned imports were remade in colonial Vietnam. Vietnamese coffee is an adaptation of a café au lait, but it's made with condensed milk instead, as opposed to the fresh milk that you might have had in Paris. The kitchen was the site of collaboration, but it was also the site of resistance in Vietnam. One of the most iconic Vietnamese dishes, of course, is pho, and it's actually probably not really of Vietnamese origin. Most likely this soup, which has rice noodles in it and then very thin slices of beef, which are cooked almost rare in the French style, was a colonial adaptation of the very French pot de feu, as opposed to being something older and more traditionally Vietnamese. In the 1930s, patriotic writers helped to reinvent the dish of pho. They got rid of its imperial genealogy and they took it on as a nationalist symbol. They ironically traced its origins back to an earlier invasion of Vietnam by the Mongols, who supposedly introduced hot pots to Vietnam in the 14th century. All of that political consciousness took place in middle-class cookbooks, which carried advertisements for anti-colonial publications. Now, this was very much an urban story in Vietnam. Peasants in the Vietnamese countryside didn't have the opportunity to sample many French delicacies. Many of them could scarcely afford to even eat rice as the colonial regime expanded its agricultural exports. But in fact, there was a major impact of imperialism on the French diet itself. While rice had really never been part of the traditional French diet, it had occasionally come into French cuisine as pilafs, it became more and more common in metropolitan France over the course of the 19th century. The Vietnamese commercial economy meant that Vietnamese peasants were often exporting their rice back to France, and so they had to substitute on less rice and more things like maize or sweet potatoes. Again, that's a common story that was also playing out in a different way in India in the same period. The biggest injustice really came in the 1940s. The French had been trying to develop wet rice agriculture in the Camargue region near Marseille in the country's south for decades, but they had never really been successful in this project. In the 1940s, the French began importing, largely by force, skilled rice workers from Vietnam to France. Ironically, they called them ouvriers non spécialisés, or non-specialized worker. There's a really good graphic novel by Pierre Dôme and Clément Ballou which tells the story of the Camargue rice workers from Vietnam. It's one of the ways in which colonialism changed not only the Vietnamese diet, but the French diet, labor regimes, and agricultural exports as well. Let's shift gears and talk about Africa and the impact that colonialism and imperialism had on African diets at a slightly later point in time. As was the case in Asia, first came trade and then came political control in Africa. There were a lot of efforts to develop export industries and things like palm oil or peanut exports along the African coast in the early 19th century. And by the 1830s, European explorers and missionaries were charting the interior of Africa for the first time. 50 years later, by the 1880s, European powers were dividing up the continent in what we would later know as the Scramble for Africa. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium cut up the continent, and only Ethiopia remained mostly independent through the 19th and early 20th century. But in contrast to the case of, say, India or Southeast Asia, the physical occupation of Africa was a lot more difficult because of the difficulty in communication and things like railway building. It wasn't really until the 1930s that Europeans asserted some kind of control over the vast spaces that had been drawn out 50 years earlier on imperial maps. We've got our kind of common image of colonial Africa. It's like the picture of Dr. David Livingstone with a pith helmet and a hunting rifle, maybe a solitary explorer who's just plumbing the depths of the continent. But this is basically a mythology. It's a colonial mythology. And it neglects the really long train of native porters who would provide travelers with things like canned meat or biscuits, bottles of beer, wine, Vichy water for the French, and all these staples of European civilization which accompanied European explorers in Africa. Famously, Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand brought cases of champagne all the way from Congo to Sudan in 1898. Europeans in Africa wanted to eat familiar foods, but they also enjoyed shooting big game, and they frequently debated the culinary merit of things like zebra or hippopotamus or crocodile. Not surprisingly, these colonists who were obsessed with hunting acquired a reputation for waste and profligacy among Africans who often were eating just a single daily meal. The effort to forcibly feed Europeans locally and through agricultural exports dramatically changed African ecology. The fragile nature of the soil in Africa had prompted the development of really highly complex agricultural systems. It's like the system we saw in Mexico with the three sister plants. In Nigeria, Igbo farmers intercropped numerous varieties of yam with taro, groundnuts, and chili peppers as they combined native domesticates with Asian and American foods to provide a balanced diet while also maintaining soil fertility and compensating for pretty irregular rains. European colonial agriculture couldn't have been more different. Colonial plantations concentrated on individual cash crops meant for European markets. Senegalese peanuts and Nigerian oil palms found new applications in industrial technologies, as making soap and industrial lubricants. Coffee and cacao plantations in the Gold and Ivory Coasts employed irrigation and fertilizers, and they had devastating long-term consequences on African soil. Colonial regimes also had equally dramatic effects on local social arrangements. The goal of reproducing European agricultural and industrial revolutions led to the enclosure of land and livestock, and administrators resettled scattered hamlets into larger fixed villages, which increased demands on already marginal soils. The plantation system drew migrant workers, all of whom were males, into the arid interior, and it doubled the workload of the women who stayed behind closer to the coasts. Commercialization of food production also threatened communal support systems designed to spread the risks of a bad harvest. While people in Africa had traditionally shared the fruits of agricultural labor with distant family members, foods purchased with cash as a new instrument of acquisition were often considered exempt from those obligations, and so it led to increased inequality in Africa, which had already been decimated by the slave trade. Missionary teachers were obsessed with questions of food. They sought to transform African eating habits and to instill bourgeois Christian family values instead. But European meals often didn't do the trick for African eaters. There wasn't that traditional balance of porridge and relish, and so it left many Africans feeling hungry and unsatisfied after a European-style meal. Nutrition only became an important idiom in the colonial agenda when mining official companies would call for better rations so that they could get greater productivity from their often forced workers. Africans took the initiative in coping with European colonial demands. The Sine people of Senegal successfully incorporated peanut exports into their existing crop rotations, so they helped to preserve social networks even in the face of colonialism. Igbo women and men in Nigeria often voluntarily concentrated their labor on palm oil exports to earn more cash, even when doing so meant replacing yams with more productive but less nutritious manioc. For a moment in the early 20th century, women across the continent had a brief economic boom when they turned to commercial brew beering as a regular source of income in cities, rather than as an occasional festive activity. They made profits and they often supplemented a diminishing family income. But this also led to an increase in drunkenness in urban Africa, in spite of colonial restrictions on alcohol. And moreover, brew beering became one of the first industrial domains to be established in Africa, and bottled beer began to replace more nutritious, freshly made beers, and so women ended up losing a valuable source of cash income. It's really hard for us to run a balance sheet on all of this, but throughout the 19th and early 20th century, across Africa, European-educated colonial elites became even more convinced of the success of metropolitan culture. There were some positive benefits to all of this. On the one hand, it means that you could and you can still get a fantastic baguette in the Côte d'Ivoire or in Senegal. But in many former French colonies, foreign exchange got lavishly spent on imported French cheese or wines. And important components of local diets, things like wild greens, insects, small animals, were sacrificed as contributions to local diets, while urban markets became increasingly dependent on expensive imported wheat and rice. The civilizing mission in Asia and in Africa, while it was theoretically based on objective science, reflected immense European cultural bias about the superiority of their food habits. The local knowledge of indigenous farmers in all of these places often proved a lot more productive in the long term than commercial agriculture based on irrigation and fertilizers that plundered natural resources. Maybe the biggest and most insidious impact of colonialism on foodways was in breaking down a lot of the social mechanisms which were designed to ensure collective survival in difficult environments. But it's clear that colonialism transformed diets in both Africa, in Asia, and back in Europe. Asian elites with their own haute cuisines often proved more resistant to European influence than their African counterparts. But imperial exploitation had severe nutritional, social, and economic consequences across continents. We've covered a lot of ground today, so let's leave it there. Next time, we're going to turn our attention to some of these same themes in the American context, talking about food, race, and food and migration as they played out in the United States in the 19th and 20th century. We'll pick it up then. See you next time.